Well, hello and welcome to this New Zealand Initiative webinar. My name is Oliver Hartwich and I'm the Executive Director here at the Initiative. And it's my great pleasure to welcome Professor Barbara Oakley to this webinar. Hello, Barbara.
I'm so happy to be here, Oliver.
And I welcome all of you watching us today. And for those of you who are regulars in our webinars, this webinar will be a little bit different because we only really have one speaker, and that's you, Barbara. And usually what we do is we have a bit of a presentation, and then afterwards we have a Q&A. Actually, today we're going to have two presentations, both from Barbara. But before we get to that, let me just explain who Barbara is. And then she will introduce herself a little bit with her presentation anyways. So Barbara is a professor of engineering at Oakland University in Michigan, US. She's also a senior fellow here with the New Zealand Initiative and has been with us for the past couple of weeks now. And she will be with us until the end of July. We have known each other for quite a while because we ran into each other at a conference in Spain, of all places, in 2018, I believe it was. And ever since, Barbara expressed a wish to, at some stage, come back to New Zealand because, I say come back, because you got married here a few years ago.
Yes.
I think we leave it there. And so we were excited and delighted when you expressed that wish to come to New Zealand because we, one of the world's leading experts in science, which is all curious because actually by background, Barbara is an engineer. She's a professor of engineering. Actually, with further background, she had a career in the US Army as well. And so it's an absolute pleasure to have you with us today. And what we're going to do in this webinar is, as I said, we will first hear a presentation which should all give us a snapshot into the work on learning how to learn. We will then open up to your questions, which you can file, as always, via Slido. And for those of you who have never done this before, it's actually quite simple. All you have to do is you go to slido.com, you put in the code of this webinar, which is 3762639. You will also have this, of course, in your materials from when you registered. You can log your questions, you can vote on everybody else's questions, and I will put the most popular questions to Barbara after her presentation. After the first round, we will then have a special application of Barbara's work, and that is we will look into AI, artificial intelligence, and how all of that is linked into neuroscience, and actually whether there are any similarities between how our brain works and how large language models, AI, work. So that will be the second part, and after the second part of this webinar, we will again have time for questions and answers. But right now, I think without further ado, I might hand you over to Barbara for the first presentation. Over to you.
Okay. So if you happen to have seen something I've presented before, I just want to make sure that we're all pretty much on the same page. So I'll quickly kind of get us in line with looking at learning from a neuroscientific perspective, which sounds a little too deep to be useful, but you'll see it's actually quite useful. So let's see, I think we're pulling it up right now. And let's see, where are we? There we go. Okay. So I am from Oakland University, which is actually, people often think, oh, you know, that's California, it's nice, it's sunny, well, no, actually, I am from Michigan. And so that's me on a typical February day going to work. And I teach that course, Learning How to Learn, with Terry Sanowski. And this is Terry going to work on a typical February day himself. That's one of the great things about online learning is that it allows both professors and students to get together from very different places. And this actually relates to work we're doing with the New Zealand Initiative with online, creating online materials. But so I was, to my shock, invited to speak at Harvard. I was a total nervous wreck because it's Harvard. And I walked in the room and I was even more nervous because it was standing room only, all around the edges. And I thought, why are there so many people here? Turns out our one little course made for virtually nothing, mostly in my basement, which you see right there, had on the order the same number of students as all of Harvard's massive open online courses and online courses put together, made for millions of dollars with hundreds of people. And so what this tells you is that people are really, really interested worldwide in how do we really learn. And there's a lot to be gained from looking from a neuroscientific perspective. So let's take a quick overview at what happens when we're learning. It's not all mush up there. It turns out that that fundamental building block, which is the neuron, is really at the heart of how we learn. In essence, to understand a neuron, you can just kind of think of it a little bit like a space alien that's got legs on it, right? Those are called dendrites. And you've got these little toes on the legs. Those are called dendritic spines. And you can see, and those actually are key to learning. And lastly, you have an arm that's called an axon that reaches out. That's all you need to know about how neurons work. No, except that they like to reach out and touch one another, tickle their toes. And what that really means is that they are reaching out and they are sending signals every time you are learning something, mostly electrical, partly neurotransmitter. But what those signals are doing are whenever you're actually learning something, you're making connections between neurons in long-term memory in the neocortex scattered around your brain. This is whether you're learning to take a derivative in math or conjugate a verb in a foreign language or do a new dance step. Whatever you're learning, you are simply creating those connections in long-term memory. And unfortunately, we've often heard in the past that you don't need to remember things, you can just look it up. But would I look up, would I know what Spanish was and how to speak it if I always just use Google Translate? In fact, I need to have those links in my long-term memory if I'm to gain expertise in virtually anything. So how do we strengthen those links? Well, through practice. Practice of a certain kind, not just allowing your eyes to go over a page, for example. So if you don't practice, what can happen is those little sort of synaptic janitors can sweep away those dendritic spines, and what you thought you learned just melts away. So ultimately, what you're trying to do when you're learning is you're just trying to create a nice set of strong neural links that you can easily pull to mind whenever you might need it. So once you have a set of links involving something you know already, you can use that as that prior knowledge as insight to help you much more easily bridge into new ideas. For example, if you know how water flows, what the idea of current is, just from thinking about how water flows, you can much more easily use that idea to bridge into the concept of how electrical current flows. And that metaphorical approach, saying that electrical current is the current of water, can help you grasp key ideas much more quickly. Of course, every metaphor breaks down sooner or later. You just throw it away at that thing and get a new metaphor. So metaphors are really powerful in helping us learn. We come up with them. Well, it used to be I'd tell people, go Go look on websites, read nonfiction books. There's collections of metaphors. But now you can just go to ChatGPT and it will give you great metaphors. So, for example, let's say you're teaching about how to Python programming. How do you explain the ideas of main guard versus scope? Well, it's easy. Just ask ChatGPT and it will say main guard is like the gatekeeper of a castle. Scope are like the rooms within the castle. Of course, it'll give you a lot more information besides. So this use of metaphor is often to help us learning is often something we forget to do. You're struggling with a concept and you don't think to say, okay, here's the concept. I can't really get what they're talking about. Can you explain it to me? And if you just use ChatGPT this way, it can be incredibly, incredibly helpful.
Thank you very much, Barbara, for this introduction. We have time to discuss this presentation now. Just to remind all our viewers, ask your own questions, log on to slido.com, put in the code 3762639, and you can ask your questions. First question, actually, I can answer straight away, because will there be a recording of the webinar? Yes, there will be. Give us a day or two, and it will be on our YouTube channel. But next question here is actually that the Learning How to Learn course has been running for around about 10 years.
Yes.
For the benefit of us early attendees, one of our viewers asked, how has the course changed as a result of more recent research?
Oh, so that is a great question, and I haven't been asked that before, so it makes it more fun for me. The great thing is that because we built the course from a solid neuroscientific perspective, actually all the ideas that we're using and the central approaches are right in line, and we're just finding more support for these ideas. But I will tell you what we are doing is we are dusting off and creating new versions of the videos that take advantage of AI to help us have really some pretty compelling and really funny sort of twists on the videos. So if you go back and look at videos, I believe it's 1, 2, 3, and maybe 4, the first 3 or 4 videos, you will see that they are really, they're quite spiffy, and they use the same approaches, but just some cool new twists to them.
Maybe I can ask a follow-up question then. How has your brain changed over the past 10 years? Because you have become much more experienced in presenting.
Oh, something I often don't tell people is that I was such a nervous presenter that I actually had to go see a specialist therapist in how do you present in public, because I was so shy that I would not be able to breathe when I was speaking in public.
You wouldn't get the impression these days.
Well, what is it they call immersion therapy or something like that, where you, like, if you're afraid of spiders, they'll put spiders around you and that kind of thing. I think when you are in front of audiences enough, after a while you begin to see them as your friend, and they are. It's so exciting.
Well, that
So
seems to
now
be a
it's
common
fun.
feature of your life. I think I remember you once said you didn't like mathematics to start with, and then you became a professor of engineering. So is there a bit of a pattern with you that when you feel you're not particularly good at something, you're doing it even more so?
I think there is some of that, and there is an excellent research paper that says that, in essence, growing comfortable with feeling uncomfortable is a great way to actually learn and grow as a person. So I think I grew comfortable with being uncomfortable, and I've continued that pattern.
Do you think our schools nowadays are doing that enough with students, putting them into uncomfortable positions so that they can grow?
No, I don't think they are. And I think it's for well-meaning reasons. But for example, often teachers won't cold call on students. That is, randomly just call on anyone. So anyone could be put on the spot. And the reason for that is they don't want to make students feel uncomfortable.
Hmm.
But what research shows is the best way to help your students feel more comfortable and actually get them to volunteer more in the class
Mhm.
is through cold calling, because then they get used to, okay, and they actually learn more because they know they could be put on the spot. But of course, there's gentler, kinder ways to cold call. You might put the particularly tough question on someone who you know can handle it. But having this kind of this is a nurturing environment, even though at first glance it may seem, oh, it's harder for students.
Let's take another question from Slido. Just as a reminder, Slido code is 3762639. And here's a question: why am I slow to learn? But once I have, I can teach anyone, and they love the way I communicate.
Oh, and I love you already.
That's a question from Michelle. Yes. So
that I remember you are very much like me. And I think, there I have to be a little bit glib in response, because that's actually a deep question, and there are probably many aspects to that question. But let's take Nobel Prize winner Friedrich Hayek. He said, oh, I was such a slow learner. You compare me with all these other the people I went through classes with, and I just thought, oh, I'm so slow. And but he said that ultimately what was what led to his breakthrough insights, that because he had to go slowly, couldn't like jump to conclusions like much faster learners would, and he would see the mistakes that those faster learners made. So I do think that learning more slowly can help you learn more deeply, and that helps you to explain things better to others.
let's take the next question, and which builds on that. So if I struggle to learn, does that mean my neurons are not making the requisite connections or signals?
No, it doesn't necessarily mean that. What it can mean is that, for example, research in dyscalculia, that is a real difficulty with trying to learn math, you would think, oh, they just don't have the connections there. But it turns out they have too many connections. So they see this possibility and this one and this one and this one. And so it's hard for them to know which pathway, because not because they can't see the right, it's there sees too many possibilities. So this may be, part of your challenge in learning may be simply that you've got a really creative brain that sees a lot of pathways.
Of all the learning how to learn content, which key point do you think has the most impact on the learning experience?
Retrieval practice.
Do you want to explain what that is?
Okay. So retrieval practice means when you are trying to learn something, you put it away and you see if you can pull it from your own brain. So that's part of what note taking is. I mean, let's say that you are taking notes. You often want to, I'm not sure you can see it, but I drew a line, if you can see, right down this part of the page. So I take notes on this side. I put a little keyword on the side there. I cover up my notes with my hand and I look at the keyword and say, oh, can I retrieve from my own mind what those key ideas are? You might use flashcards. Those are effective. Now, sometimes people will say, oh, retrieval practice, that's only for really trivial facts, what date was the French Revolution or something like that. But That's not true at all. It depends on what retrieval questions you ask yourself. Let's say you're walking to work or to school, and you could ask yourself, what are the key aspects of the French and Russian revolutions, and how do they compare with one another? Now, if you can be thinking about that as you're walking safely to whatever your next, you're actually pulling very deep, important ideas from your own mind and cementing in new connections. So retrieval practice is it's an old idea, but it's a very powerful one.
And it can happen in so many different ways, can't it? I remember actually when I wrote my doctoral thesis, after each chapter, when the day's work was done, I was going for a walk and basically try to give a lecture to myself on what I've just written, just to see whether that kind of made sense and whether I kept it in my mind. Is that what you mean?
Exactly, that's what I mean. And sometimes you might think, oh, either you might think, well, I can't remember all this stuff. How can I remember what I just wrote? But even that struggle to understand and pull to mind the key ideas will help to solidify and also to allow you to catch errors in your thinking. Another trick you can pull for retrieval practice is right before you go to sleep at night. Pull to mind the last 1 or 2 minutes. Pull to mind what you're trying to, think about, learn, understand, remember. And what that will do, it will start those little pathways going. And during your sleep, you will send signals hundreds of times over those pathways. And in the morning, you go, oh, that was the answer to this. Or you can pronounce a new word more effectively in a foreign language or whatever.
Are there any limits to that? Or asked differently, has there ever been a case where you really desperately wanted to understand or learn something and found yourself unable to?
Um, you have to be that's a good question, but I'm sure that if I was trying to understand deep quantum physics, and I was trying to do it overnight, no way.
Mhm.
There's always limits to everything, but I guess I know enough to try to choose something that I think is graspable in the next, few hours, few days, few months. But one thing, so Newton, Sir Isaac Newton, they would say that he would learn something and he would write about it, and then he would put it away for several years. But when he would return to it, it would be at a much deeper level.
Mhm.
And what was going on in the background was these consolidations, these new connections, even while he was not thinking.
So the famous TV chef, Julia Childs, she said everyone can cook, and you would say everyone can learn, because there are no fundamental differences between people. Anyone can really do that.
I have
It's not a special talent.
It's not a special talent at all. In fact, I've taught severely mentally learning disabled individuals, so labeled, who were IQ of around 70, who had been told they could never learn and never go to any and they used some of these ideas like retrieval practice, like the Pomodoro technique, like which is a very simple technique to help you concentrate. And they were sitting in and attending college classes and actually getting out of
Actually, what is the role of IQ in all of this?
Let me, that's a good question. IQ does matter, and there is a genetic component. It's unquestioned, but actually, a surprising amount of the time, you just need a good enough IQ. You don't need to be an intellectual superstar. One of the most brilliant physicists, um, of the 20th century had an IQ of 125. So
Sometimes a high IQ might work against you.
because you can find so many more ways to do it wrong. And also highly intelligent people, except for you, have been shown to have more of a propensity for being inflexible. So once they can jump to conclusions, and when they're wrong, they can't change their mind because it fixes in, and that's part of their intelligence, but also a liability.
Let's take the next question from Slido, and that leads us then almost straight into the next part of the presentation, because it's a question about AI. Any tips for prompting strategies to get Gen AI to create metaphors and analogies for learning? What usually works well, doesn't work from your experience?
Oh, so sometimes what I might do, for example, when I was in Mongolia, the professors in Ulaanbaatar, the capital, would tell me, we're city people. We just don't understand our students who are sometimes coming off the Mongolian steppe. And so, so what do we do? And I said, go and tell them about your students and ask for a metaphor. So like for Python programming and main guard and scope, they might get a metaphor related to yurts and migratory patterns and things that really a student could identify with who was coming off the steppe. So that's what you can do as well. Tell them about your own personal, like if you're a fan of, I don't know, horseback riding, you tell it to give you some hints for metaphors in terms of horsemanship or the different breeds of horses, or whatever. If you're a postage stamp collector, whatever your background, that can be a very helpful. So even ask it like meta questions. What questions should I be answering to give you insight so that you could answer my questions about metaphors better?
Okay. We will now hear from you about AI and how that links into your neuroscience work. But before we get into the presentation, once more reminder, ask your questions while Barbara's presenting. The Slido code is 3762639. And over to you, Barbara.
Okie dokie. Okay. And we're pulling things up on the screen here. And okay. So last we left off, we were talking about the importance of metaphors. So what that means is really if we're talking about metaphors, we can actually think of large language models, generative AI platforms like metaphors. So in that sense, what I'm really saying is those large language models like ChatGPT or Claude or Gemini, they're like engines in a car. And if you learn how to drive a car, any car, you can get into a car that has a different engine and you can still drive it. There's a little bit of difference in handling characteristics, but it's not a big deal. So I like to think of the large language models as kind of like car engines. But what we're speaking of large language models, what I want to say is we talked about creation of neural links in long-term memory and how important that is for learning. But I was kind of tricking you. I didn't mention that there are actually two different ways that those links can be created. And if we learn a little bit about them, we can learn about the very large language model that is in our head. So, in fact, AI experts and neuroscientists have worked together, and AI experts created large language models based off of how our large language works. So let's just get a little sense of it. If you look, we have this working memory in our prefrontal cortex. And that is where we can temporarily hold information before we send it on through the hippocampus into long-term memory. That's when we're hearing, for example, an explanation of something that we're learning. This hippocampal pathway, declarative pathway, is what we do when we're hearing explanations. Right now, you are hearing and taking in through your working memory this information I'm sharing with you. It's going through your hippocampus into long-term memory. There's that other pathway I mentioned. And this pathway goes through the basal ganglia. This is the pathway of our habitual thinking and of our learning, having learned things so well that it's kind of a different, it begins to form a different kind of pattern in the mind. We need both approaches to be able to function really effectively on a broad range of things that we're learning. But in some sense, what's going on in the brain, if we shift perspective slightly, we can see there's this blue box will represent that declarative pathway, and the orange box is that automatic pathway. So when we're thinking kind of consciously about something, let's say we're trying to solve a math problem. So we've got, step by step working through the math problem. We're conscious of it, and that's how we learn it. But let's say we're not learning a math problem. Let's say we're actually hitting a baseball. How do we learn to hit a baseball? Mostly, we're never conscious of how we learn it. In fact, what happens is we tell our basal ganglia, we're not conscious of it. We say, okay, basal ganglia, hit the baseball. We see the results. Did we hit it in the right way? Oh, no, we didn't. So we do it again. And then we do it again. And we keep doing it, and we get better and better about hitting the baseball. But it's kind of magic how that happens, because we have no idea how our brain is learning. We're not conscious of this learning. What is going on with this basal ganglia learning pathway? It is, as it turns out, a deep neural network. And this deep neural network is, if you look, these little circles mean that they're neurons, and the lines are the axon, the dendritic spine, and the dendrite leading to the next neuron. So it's like rows or layers of neurons, and those rows or layers, they're quite deep, which is why I say a deep neural net. And this processing system is actually how we learn to hit the baseball. Watch this. We hit it once, and what we're doing is we're telling our brain, oh, okay, we hit the baseball. And our brain, kind of goes through, and it's trying to figure out how to hit the baseball. And you see, oh, did you hit? So you try it again, and then you try it again. And as you're practicing, you're strengthening some connections, and you're weakening others. You're balancing those neural nets as you're gradually learning how to hit that baseball. And guess what? This is actually how we learn our native language. So it is a large language model in some very great sense within our own brain. So it's in fact, this system right here, that basal ganglia automatic system, is strongest in children. And that's why children can learn their native language with ease, with intuitive, real intuition for whatever they're learning. It also turns out this is a pattern recognition system. So if you memorize the multiplication tables, it's not just, a bunch of rote facts. You begin to parse and analyze that what's going on in that multiplication table. How are those numbers related to one another? I speak in some countries, math education in some surprisingly seemingly advanced countries is so advanced that, or so retrograde, that what they find is their nursing students cannot make the fundamental calculations to translate from one dosage to another dosage. And so what happens? They kill patients because they don't have an intuitive feel for the numbers, because they've been told don't memorize the multiplication table. Now, what happens if we've got these two different learning systems, the hippocampal system and the basal ganglia system? What happens if in humans, if this declarative conscious system is destroyed? Well, that happens in Alzheimer's patients. And guess what? They confabulate, they hallucinate, they make things up. So that's a little bit of why, that explains a bit of, why we can have problems with AI, because of course, we don't have a conscious system that conscious step-by-step approach, and it can just make things up. So just very quickly, here's a little bit about large language models. The foundational large language models, in the West at least, are ones that we're probably familiar with. You almost certainly know ChatGPT, but you should be experimenting with some of these other platforms as well. And there's also apps that they interface through these apps. For example, there's writing assistants, and those apps like Jasper have at their back end ChatGPT, because ChatGPT was first. But people have begun to find for some of these apps that they're not they don't provide that much more than ChatGPT itself. So there's research apps, though, that are trained quite differently. They're often trained, for example, semantic scholars trained on over 200 million research articles. So it's really a different training set than ChatGPT itself, and it's really quite helpful. But there's lots and lots of different apps that you can get. There's ones especially for teachers that can be really helpful. I should say, if you're a student, do not look at Gallup, which is really popular in helping students solve problems. But people often use Canva or Gamma, because what they do is they can use some of these different other apps, like the writing assistants and like these image creators and so forth. So you don't have to buy everything if you just go through some of these sort of consolidators and so forth. And I have to say thank you as well to Teaching with AI, which inspired some of this way of looking at and analyzing AI. But I hope this might be helpful for you as you're trying to figure out what should you pay for and what shouldn't you.
Wonderful. Thank you very much for that. We've got questions coming in, and reminder, you can ask your own. You can vote on our questions here, 3762639. The first question is from Stephen. And Stephen asked, the hippocampus pathway looks like it's responsible for sequencing events. Is this why storytelling is such a powerful memory technique?
Oh, interestingly enough, that basal ganglia pathway is really it helps us to sequence words. We can only put one word out at a time. It also helps us to learn to play musical instruments. And what this is, so when you're learning the sequence of how to play a musical instrument, you are also learning how to put a sound one after another. And so it's what the basal ganglia can do is help with chaining together over time what a sequence of events. That's the big thing it does. Now, the hippocampus is indeed very much involved in storytelling, and which is something that precedes and I would have to look up how, I mean, there's a temporal aspect of storytelling, but there's also it's sort of like this intuitively implies the next step in the story and the next step. And they do find that if they feed people like a bunch of parts of a little movie snippet and they're not in order, people can't remember them very well. But if they put them in the right order, it's easy to remember. So perhaps there is interaction with the basal ganglia and the hippocampus, and so perhaps that's a part of that loop as you're learning. But I would have to, that's a good question. I'd have to dive deeper to really do it justice in an answer.
Okay, let's take the next question. It's a question I've heard mixed things about the power of learning by online tutorials and videos. Are these as effective as one-on-one teaching? And if I could add to that question, what about learning with AI as your tutor?
Okay. So it all depends on the internal motivation of the student, which can be affected by face-to-face. So this is the answer is complex. I don't think there's a one size fits all, but I'll give you one example. Julius Yigo is an athlete from Kenya. He never wanted to be a long distance runner like many Kenyans have been so successful at. He wanted to learn to throw the javelin, but there were no javelin throwing coaches in all of Kenya. And he, he couldn't afford to go overseas. So he started watching YouTube videos. And he would watch these videos and then he'd go out and practice, watch and practice. And in this way, he became the world champion in throwing the javelin with a little bit of face-to-face coaching, as people begin to realize his enormous talent. But the thing is that talent was nurtured and developed solely online. He had to go and do it himself, but he was motivated. So sometimes people will point towards Khan Academy and say, well, see, people can learn well on Khan Academy, and they can, but people often go to Khan Academy because they want explanations that will help them. In other words, they're already motivated. So how can people get motivated? Sometimes you happen upon it yourself. You can see a video that sparks you. But oftentimes we become motivated because we're around someone and they're like so enthusiastic about whatever they're talking about that you catch it yourself. And there's plenty of evidence that enthusiasm becomes mirrored within you when you see someone who is really enthusiastic. You can lose a little bit of that directness when you have to go through the online medium, but it can still be there. So remember that there's going to be like lots and lots of bias and pushback a bit against online because regular face-to-face teachers are really nervous about it. But I think it's okay for them to be nervous about it because it can help inspire them to become better teachers.
Well, then let's take a follow-up question on that aspect. Would you expect a future more focused on self-learning, and how should schools and universities adapt and evolve?
Oh, such a good question. I what is the one thing that schools should be teaching students? How to learn effectively. What's the one thing they don't teach students? Almost never do they teach students how to learn effectively. The other thing is they never teach them, or very rarely, about personal finances, but that's another issue. So uh, my hope is that the future will hold I think it holds great promise that we can start incorporating. Can you believe that students go through 12 to 16 years of education and never get a course in how to learn effectively? And I mean, I can understand this because in the past, some of the methods that were, being perpetrated on students were a little questionable. But there's really good evidence-based approaches to learning, and that is why I am here with the New Zealand initiative to share these ideas.
And that's what we are trying to share with the rest of the country and all our teachers, of course, and that's why you're here as well. Got a very good question from Michelle again. Is it true that we learn better when we're happy, or at least not unhappy?
Not necessarily. We always like to say, people just don't learn under conditions of stress but actually the best way to learn in one shot learning is through pain. You touch that hot stove and you learn really fast. But I would say for many circumstances, it can be a good thing to be, in a happier situation in your life. But at the same time, a little stress sometimes can be helpful, and it's not bad for you. There's a concept called hormesis, and hormesis means having a tiny bit of the stressful or poisonous substance, and that helps you grow a little stronger. And if you think about it, I mean, exercise is a bit destructive for for muscles and then you have to let it rebuild, but you have to go through these stressful events in order to maintain your muscle tone. So learning is like that too. Mostly it can be really good, but if you're struggling sometimes or stressed a bit here and there, it's okay too.
Next question then. In an era of information overload, how can we ensure we are learning true knowledge instead of pseudo knowledge?
Yeah.
First, we have to define what is pseudo knowledge.
Yeah. Well, your best bet is always going to be to learn broadly. Because if you are willing to look at several sides of an issue, you can be, it's so easy to go, oh, that's misinformation. It's a bunch of lies, that you shouldn't be learning this. And it sounds like it's a bunch of lies. But then if you actually go to the source and look yourself, sometimes it's not misinformation. What was misinformation was the way it was misrepresented to you in a tiny little excerpt deliberately designed to make you think that was bad. So mostly what I do is I'm not a person who can spend my life arguing politics. Mark Twain once, he was a very famous American writer, wrote these books. And then when he died, he had one last book that he was putting out, and he said it had to be locked up for 100 years. And everybody was like, oh man, a masterpiece from Mark Twain. We can hardly wait. 100 years passed, they released the document, and it was really a bunch of just, what was going on in the day, the gossip back and forth and so forth. He missed his opportunity to really create a masterpiece, and instead just got involved in all the gossip stuff of back and forth. And so sometimes I think for each of us, it can be of great value to, kind of pick themes that are great in our lives, and try to focus on them, and also just remember that when it comes to misinformation and disinformation and potential falsehoods, the biggest thing to keep in mind is that, as Richard Feynman said, is, you know, um, it's so easy to fool yourself. And so, you could be wrong on anything.
How can we effectively motivate people to learn new things?
Be excited about it yourself. Part of the challenge is, so I remember I spent, there was a writer in the US named Cormac McCarthy, and he was a brilliant polymath. He was interested in so many different things. People often don't know he originally trained as an engineer. So when he was taught, he could write beautifully, was incredibly literary, but at the same time, he could talk easily to physicists about in-depth string theory and so forth. But so when we would get together, we would have a lunch that would last through dinner. So we're talking, 8-hour lunch. And what surprised me was Cormac was not interested in everything. And I thought, well, then why is that? Because he's one of the most brilliant people I know. And I began to realize, you know, I get hundreds of emails from just, it's like, what's the etymology of this word? What's going on in Patagonia, as far as travel things. I get emails about everything because I'm interested in a lot of things, but I have to turn things off because otherwise I'll never do any deeper learning. So when students are, they might be coming into our classes and they're not particularly interested, and we're like, oh no, they should have this intrinsic desire to learn what I'm teaching. And they don't have to have that. My job is to help motivate them to get more enthusiastic about whatever I'm teaching. So I think it's okay that we're not interested in every single thing because you have to focus. In fact, those with autism, the sort of the doctor who originally, Dr. Asperger, who came up with that diagnosis of Asperger's, said it's a peculiarly valuable syndrome because it allows them to really focus on certain things and ignore things that a lot of other people are really interested in. But then that serves them in good stead if they're becoming a doctor, an engineer, a lawyer, whatever. So I think the question more is, it's okay if we're not interested in every single thing. But if we're a teacher, how do we selfishly motivate students to be interested in our thing?
So you will spend the next 5 months in New Zealand talking to many teachers at many schools. You will talk to politicians and you will explain where you're coming from and how they can actually improve our education system with these techniques. But they might ask you then whether you've actually come across a school where that's already been implemented into the curriculum. And could you share any success stories with them?
Yes, actually, there is a private school in Sydney, Australia, that is using some of these techniques. There's also a school in northern Michigan that is the Great Lakes or the Lake Superior Academy that is using these techniques. I just I often, I sometimes I should be better at collecting these things. But for example, I just heard from a university in Canada, and they're using a lot of these different techniques, and so and they had a big session, and they're uh, with hundreds of school teachers and so forth. So um, oh, and Malvern Academy, I just spoke there in near Philadelphia. And so, yeah, there's lots. So if you just pop me an email, I can, figure out who's closest to what you're doing.
Next question. What excites you the most about the future of education and the role that you see AI playing to support educators and students?
Oh, I think that AI is going to be, it's sure the devil is in the details. We have to be really careful because what happened in the 1970s. So we know from the Flynn effect that IQ scores were rising from the 30s to the 1970s. But after the 70s, they started declining. And why? I would put it to you, although it is correlation, I would put it to you that that's when calculators came out. And it wasn't calculators that were the problem. It was the fact that suddenly people started going, huh, well, you don't need to memorize anything. You can just look it up.
Mhm.
And that became, drill is kill, that kind of thing started around that time. And so we have to make sure not to repeat the same error that they made in the 70s of thinking, oh, well, you don't have to get that knowledge in your own brain. Now that we've got ChatGPT, yes, it's a valuable tool, but don't let that replace the true learning that students still need to do. But at the same time, you can ask, for example, you can take a picture of your class notes and say, what's a really good hook to help my students really get more curious about this? And if you can evoke their curiosity at the beginning of a class, what that does is it gets dopamine out there, kind of like hanging out, it's like you're reading or you're watching a movie that is a suspense thriller, and you're waiting to see what the ending is. And when that ending comes and they figure out what you're talking about, they get really they can learn better because that dopamine helps seal those connections between the neurons. So it's really I think there's so much excitement, and it will make things so much easier for teachers as we are able to have grading that's somewhat automated, so teachers don't have to spend so much time. And I think we have so much ahead of us because we're really finally understanding how does the brain learn, and it's a new era ahead of us.
Let's take a slightly different questions to finish the conversation on. Someone who wants to know, what suggestions do you have for the younger generation to create a positive impact in a competitive society? And is learning ethics more necessary these days?
Oh, Oliver and I were just talking about ethics and learning the traditions that our society have grown from is really an important thing that for us to be teaching our students. And so I think that's a wonderful question. And I do want to say that we have to be wary about teaching ethics, because when you teach ethics, you are teaching only to the choir. In other words, ethical people will listen to you. And those like certain psychopathic students who have done a disservice, shall we say, incredibly mildly to others, they will listen. They will tell you what you want to hear, and and still doing them. This is why it's so important to have a society that is well structured and transparent. So you can, when someone is violating ethics, you can see what's going on and ensure that they suffer the consequences to the extent that they're not hurting other people. I think this is a really important thing to do. That's a wonderful, wonderful question.
Right. Well, New Zealand is really fortunate to have you. We are very lucky to have you here in the office for the next few months, and we look forward to you sharing your stories, your learnings, your insights with New Zealand and with our teachers, and hopefully we can create a better education system where students actually learn how to learn. But for now, thank you, Barbara. It's a pleasure having you here. Thank you all for watching, and we will see you at our next webinar. Thank you. Bye-bye.